Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 466, and it is titled A History of Sculpture, and it is written by Murray Sheehan, M.A., copyright 1924. This will be part 6, and possibly the final part of this book. And we'll start where we left off, to top of page, near the top of page 49, with a new chapter called the 18th Century. The 18th century was in general far less oratorical in its sculpture than had been the age of Louis XVI. Ornate tombs were still erected to the princes of the world, and allegory still held its own with a tenacity which it is hard for us to understand. But on the whole, one may say that flamboyancy was no longer so much favored in sculpture. As a matter of fact, in the latter part of the century, a Neoclassical Reform swept over the art, which went as much to the opposite extreme of restraint and coldness as Bernini had swung in the direction of exaggeration and ecstasy. This was brought about partly by the natural ebb and flow of periodical changes of style from one tendency to another, but also partly through the first discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum and the slopes of Mount Vesuvius in 1755, which reawakened public interest in things antique, and especially in classic sculpture. In France, Le Monet, 1704 to 1788, carried over from his master Robert de Lorraine the older tradition in portraits, and although many of these depicting nobles were destroyed during the French Revolution, we know him for a master in the essentially French art. Among his pupils were Pignali, 1714 to 1785, whose elaborate tomb of the Marshal Maurice of Saxony in Strasbourg and seated Mercury are still admired, and Falconet, 1716 to 1791, known chiefly for his heroic bronze statue of Peter the Great in Petrograd, has it disappeared, and his delicately feminine bather in the Louvre. In the second half of the century came two sculptors most unlike and yet most admirable, both of them. Clodion, 1738 to 1814, produced chiefly an enormous number of delicate fantasies in terracotta, plaster, and porcelain, depicting nymphs, satyrs, cupids, etc., in statuettes and bas-reliefs, fit objects to decorate the frivolous boudoirs before the Revolution, but exquisite, all of them. These really were supreme little bits of that art, which does not take itself too seriously, and they must be ranked high in the total history of art. But the other was one of the supreme portraitists of all time, Rodin, 1744 to 1828, a pupil of Le Mans, worthy to rank with the Florentines of the Quattrocento in his winning sense of vivacity and physiological insight. His seated figures of Voltaire and Roget, and his busts, including masterly portraits of R. Franklin, Washington, and John Paul Jones, are living likenesses that put the man before us in more than everyday reality, just as do the finest portraits of Titian or Vasquez. In Italy there came the restrained flair of cold light, whom we know as Canova, 1757 to 1822, graceful but frigid statues of Cupid and Psyche, Perseus, and other mythological subjects won great admiration from a generation wearied of Bernini, but not possessed of the true classic spirit. His example spread, and Rome once more became the great rallying ground of sculptors, who now flock there from all parts of Europe and from America. De Necker, 1758 to 1841, a German, fell under the sway of Canova and created the Adrian on a panther, which we all know. Flaxman, 1755 to 1826, an Englishman, under the same influence, produced work which gained a wide reputation that seems incredible to us today, although some of his designs for the famous Wedgwood pottery are truly admirable. Thorwaldsen, 1770 to 1844, a Dane, outdid Canova in his own field of the coldly classical and swept all Europe with his fame. His Lion of Lucerne, carved from the living rock, although hardly in his direct tradition, is perhaps his best-known work. Then there are hosts of classical subjects in statuary and in reliefs, and latterly a number of religious figures, mostly preserved in Copenhagen. The 19th century. The early part of the 19th century remained largely under the dominance of the classical school, and not until the middle 50s did a vital realism finally take its place as the characteristically typical style of modern sculpture. Paris then took up the leading position as Florence and Rome had done in the early and late Renaissance, and ruled over sculpture as she did also over painting and architecture. The Romantic movement showed itself as a swing back. The early part of the 19th century remained largely under In Germany, we need mention only two sculptors in the first half of the century. Rauch, of 1777 to 1857, created that equestrian statue of Frederick the Great, which heads unter den Linden at Berlin, and the seated figure of Maximilian I at Munich, as well as other monuments. Generally possessed of true dignity and power. Hold on. Need to rub my eye for a second. Ritschl, 1804 to 1861. His pupil is best known for his statue to Goethe and Schiller at Weimar. The distinctly naturalistic trend of the latter part of the century can be exemplified for us here by the Mounted Amazon and at Berlin by Tullian, born in 1862, and the stylistic treatment of figures, which has been the chief concern of most recent German sculptors, can be exemplified by the Witzelsbach formation at Munich by Heidelbrand, born in 1847. Max Klinger, born in 1857, painter and etcher, produced colorful statues, among others, that of Beethoven at Leipzig, perhaps the most gripping presentation of that musical giant. Belgium in the 19th century produced one masterly sculptor, Meinauer, 1831 to 1910, a realist with a classical sense of form and rhythm. He confined himself entirely to laboring types and has produced immortal bronzes of the stevedore, the sower, etc. Pardon me. In these and in his equally fine reliefs of kindred subjects, he has caught the essential dignity of the human frame, embodying a spirit undaunted by physical labor. Columbia University has one very beautiful work of his set up in one of their open courts. Russia was deprived of sculpture by the hostility of the church, which retained its Byzantine hatred of carved figures, and by the state, which forbade the erection of bronze statues except in honor of the royal family. Marble was particularly unobtainable in Russia, and thus, until the 19th century, she had but little sculpture. Prince Paul Trubetskoy has created a number of small bronze figures of a free technique hardly applicable to larger works. Noam Arson, a remarkable Jewish peasant from the northwest Russia, brought with him a wealth of sympathetic love of beauty, which he has embodied in marbles in his Paris studio. In England, the early years of the century were given over to the neoclassical imitation of the ancients, and it was not until Alfred Stevens, 1817 to 1875, came back filled with the admiration for the works of Michelangelo that the spell was broken. He was commissioned to do the Wellington Monument for St. Paul's Cathedral at London, and in it he produced a work which even today is striking in its figures, and especially so if compared with the weak contemporary work. Watts, 1817 to 1904, and Lord Leighton, 1830 to 1896, were two painters who also gained fame with their sculpture. The athlete strangling a python exhibited by the latter at the Chicago Exposition may be said to have helped guide not only English sculpture, but American as well. His lovely figure of this sluggard, showing a boy stretching himself, is in the Tate Gallery at London. Alfred Gilbert, born in 1854, has tended to become over-ornate, whereas Thorncroft, born in 1850, has never surpassed the remarkably lithe trousseau, which he exhibited at Chicago. Epstein, born in 1880, seems to delight in shocking England with crude figures such as his Christ, for instance. Modern France. The first notable figure in French sculpture for the 19th century was Rodin, 1784 to 1855, whose heroic high relief of the Marseillaise on the big Arc de Triomphe at Paris is universally admired, filled with the action that its subject required. It successfully broke with the tradition of Canova and Thorwaldsen, and entered the vivacity which had marked the work of Rodin and Puget. Then came the realism of Byron, 1796 to 1875, with his striking animal figures, of which the Corcoran Gallery at Washington owns an almost complete collection. Many of his admirable lions, tigers, etc. were set up in life-size in the parks of Paris, some of them depicting fights between two enraged animals, for instance, his fight between a tiger and a crocodile. Freimite, 1824 to 1900, also depicted animals, although he was a pupil of Rodin. Carpanix, 1827 to 1875, famous for his group of The Dance in front of the opera at Paris, was for a time the center of a bitter combat because of the gaiety and vivacity which he had put into that group. The statue was besmittered with ink and declared to be indecent, although it has since then become the inspiration of much modern sculpture and has been largely responsible for much of our later active style of monuments. Chaput, 1833 to 1891, was more quiet in his sculpture, as is shown in his seated Jeanne d'Arc in the Luxembourg. Du Bois, 1829 to 1905, created figures of delicate grace, and his statue of the same heroine at Rheims has been duplicated at both Paris and Washington. Bartholdi, 1834 to 1904, is of especial interest to all Americans, as he was the sculptor of the huge figure of Liberty enlightening the world in bronze, which the French government presented to America, and which now stands in New York Harbor. He presents the modified classical tradition, which still continued in France, producing a host of notable artists, whom we know for one or two statues in Paris or elsewhere, but who could be hardly mentioned here in more than catalogue form. Rodin. But the dominating figure in French sculpture in the 19th century was Rodin, 1840 to 1917, an enigma to many people, but also by many people considered one of the greatest sculptors of all time. Beginning as the realist, with his Man with the Broken Nose and his Age of Bronze, which he had to take into court to prove that he had not merely molded it from a living model. He came in the latter years of his life to a style marked for his breadth and even license, as for instance in those cases where he left the greater part of his figures in the rough, only partially detaching them from the marble. He was equally great in stone and in bronze, and those who knew his sketches and paintings declare him to have been a master of drawing as well. Realist though he was, Rodin was in another sense a sublime idealist, for with him the thought expressed in his statues was the main thing. This it was which led him to leave in an unfinished condition so many of his works. As soon as his idea had been expressed, he did not care to go on further with the statue, and when once this point of view had been gained, one is no longer irritated by the seeming laxity of the man. Indeed, the bronze or the marble seems all the more participating with life. One can almost see it quivering into expression from the dull and lifeless mass of mere matter it was before the master laid hand to its shaping. For never was there a more delicate craftsman than Rodin. In love with the finest curves of throat and nostril and thigh, his St. John the Baptist may at first seem awkward and lacking in beauty, but longer acquaintance and study reveal the deeper symmetry and especially the inner spiritual meaning of the bronze, as is almost always the case with his works. The later work of Rodin, as for instance The Thinker, has been called pessimistic, and it is true that in some of his figures at this time the naturalistic bent of the sculptor has carried him to a rude display of knotted muscles which seem to belong to another race than those smooth and rounded creatures whom Cavona depicted. But at the same time he was creating such masterpieces of vision as that bust of E.H. Harriman, which several years ago was displayed in the Metropolitan Museum at New York, and the Hand of God, which its interwoven bodies of a man and a woman lying in the shaping hand of the Creator. Also, he was portraying the very soul of the burghers of Calesis at the moment of their going forth to a willing sacrifice for their city's sake. His statue of Balzac, with its leonine head thrown back from an almost shapeless plythe, which represented the body, was refused by the authorities of Paris, who had commissioned him to do the figure, on the grounds that it was incomplete. Of course, the idea which Rodin wished to express was that the head of the man was all that counted anyway, and he wished to sink into insignificance the more corporal frame of the writer. When one sees some of the statues in our streets, on which one can count all the buttons of the man's coat, but gain no impression of his inner being, one can hardly agree with Rodin. The 20th century. Pardon me. It is both difficult and dangerous for a critic to come within the ranks of his own generation and to attempt a listing of the significant names of his own quarter century. With deep humility, therefore, knowing that quite surely I shall be committing deadly and ridiculous sins, both of omission and of commission, I take up the 20th century for a brief chronicling of its sculpture. Rodin has continued, of course, to be the dominant factor in the sculpture of the times. His influence has not always been a happy one. When exerted on sculptures less well-grounded than he was in the fundamentals, his tendency to simplify has led later theorists into the mazes and morasses of Impressionism, Vorticism, Cubism, etc., which generally have eventuated in some form of Primitivism. Matisse the painter, Gauder, Brzeska, Brancusi, etc., all are the names of some of these seeming madmen in France. Henry Bacard, winner of the competition for the Reformers' Monument in Geneva, is one of the sanest of the new men, while Emile Bourdelle derives directly from Rodin, with rugged vigor and at times a tendency to the new stylistic effects which seem to be gaining ground every day. In Germany, for instance, from the small bronzes of Franz Stuck, strangely like our own Paul Manship's work, sometimes on down through the work of Hugo Ledler, famous for his gigantic Bismarck monument, down to our own day, most of the best work has been highly conventionalized. Metzner, the creator of the huge Vulkenschnott monument at Lippsburg, has here too created a most impressive piece of work in a technique which is really something new in the world. His carvings in relief and in the round embody an original feeling which would doubtless have made itself felt in this country had it not been for the war. Indeed, in the early years of the century, the Germans were turning out some work which in various ways was perhaps the strongest being done today. Joseph Wackery was, with his figures carved in travertine, a gray stone which looks worm-eaten and yet is immensely effective for decorative figures. Benno Elkin, with strong bronzes and colored marbles. Bernard Hodiger, realist and fantasist. Anton Hanak, effective primitivist. Herman Hahn, represented in Chicago with his heroic Gothe. George Colby, a vital worker in stone and in bronze. These are some of the names to watch for in modern Germany. Then, out of Dalmata has come that young Ivan Mestovic, born in 1883, who has set all Europe to talking of his powerful figures, most of them distinctly natural in their Byzantine cast of features and in their fury of passionate revulsion against the overwhelming hordes of conquering Turks. His portraits of his mother and others have shown him a master of realistic detail, subordinated to the effect he wished to achieve, which should rank him high not only in contemporary work, but in the sculpture of all time. Pardon me. Next chapter, Sculpture in America. The tale we have now to unfold is not a happy one until we come to comparatively recent times. America awoke to sculpture, unfortunately, in the very heyday of the Neoclassic era. Howden's visit in 1785, at which he had made the statue of Washington in the state capital of Virginia, in which Miami University has a replica, left seemingly but little impression on native artists. In the early 19th century, sculptors began to go to Rome to study, where they fell in with the chilling influence of Canova and Thorwaldsen. Up to the time of the Chicago Exposition, we had been content over here with such things as the Greek Slave by Hiram Powers, 1805 to 1873, and the Colossal Figure of Freedom by Crawford, 1813 to 1857, on top of the Washington Capitol. There was some good work done, as for instance the Equestrian, Washington, and Union Square in New York City, by Henry Kirk Brown, 1814 to 1886, but contemporaneously with it, we also had such terrible hobby horse figures as the Jackson, which disfigures the park facing the White House, although William Westmore Story, 1819 to 1895, was the most widely respected sculptor in America up to the 90s, with several cold statues of women in the Metropolitan to his glory. We can almost more respect the myriad groups of John Rogers, 1829 to 1904, which at this time reposed on parlor tables and whatnots throughout the land, illustrating sentimental or patriotic themes. Good, honest workmanship, much of it, although negligible from an art point of view. Augustus St. Gaudens, 1848 to 1907, is the first great name of the new era, and in him Americans had a sculptor who was respected both at home and abroad. His Furgout statue at New York is one of our finest works of art in this country, with the wind sweeping the stalwart figure of the admiral as he stands alert. His Lincoln at Chicago is more meditative, while in the Sherman at the entrance to Central Park he has added an advancing figure of victory in front of the general's charger, which lifts the whole statue into new realms of imaginative meaning. In the Shaw Memorial opposite the Massachusetts State House, he combines in a high relief the same elements of realism and imagination in a masterly manner. But his highest achievement, in the estimation of many, was the monumental figure of grief for the tomb at Washington, where the shrouded and sorrowing figure sits with a noble sense of restrained dignity that lifts this bronze very far indeed toward the pinnacle of art. Daniel Chester French, born in 1850, will long be remembered as the creator of that gigantic figure of the Republic which ruled over the League of Honor at the Chicago Exposition. His Minuteman, erected at the bridge near Concord, is also very well known, as is his Death and the Sculptor in high relief. Frederick McMonez, born in 1863, created the great fountain facing French's huge statue at Chicago, and since then he has continued to win honor. His Nathan Hale in front of the City Hall at New York is a national possession in the highest sense of the word, and his figure of victory on the battle monument at West Point is universally admired. His dancing Bacchante, now in the Luxembourg at Paris and the Metropolitan at New York, raised a storm of divergent opinion when it was refused by the Boston officials who had ordered it on the score of indecency. It is charmingly light and delicate conception, gracefully balanced. George Gray Bernard, born in 1863, is a powerful sculptor whose immense marble of the two natures in the Metropolitan is a gripping conception. The Pennsylvania Capitol is graced with some of his finest decorative groups, while his Lincoln, now at Cincinnati, was considered too gaunt and realistic to be presented to England for erection in London. Many excellent critics consider it the finest portrait yet done in America. Bartlett, born in 1865, is a much gentler type of artist, as witness his Columbus and Michelangelo in the Congressional Library, and his decorations for the facade of the New York Public Library. John Quincy Adams Ward, 1830 to 1910, is best known perhaps for his cloaked standing figure of Henry Ward Beecher in Brooklyn, and the somewhat chill statue of Washington on the steps of the New York Sub-Treasury Building. Carl Bitter, 1867 to 1915, in his majestic work on the Wisconsin Capitol, the Lowry Memorial at Minneapolis, and the Carl Schurz, S-C-H-U-R-Z, Schurz Memorial, and the Piazza Fountain, both at New York, showed himself a master sculptor, whose early accidental death deprived us of the true artist. Bella LaPratte, born in 1867, has done some fine decorative figures, notably at the entrance to the Boston Public Library. Laredo Taft, born in 1860, is notable for his Fountain of the Lakes, his Columbus at Washington, and his towering figure of Black Hawk on the Rock River near Oregon, Illinois. Miss Bessie Potter Vaughno, born 1872, has created some admirable small figures of women and children. Mrs. Henry Payne Whitney did some characteristic sculpture for the San Francisco Exposition. Dallin, born 1861, has concentrated largely on Indian figures to be found in Chicago, Kansas City, Boston, Philadelphia, etc. As witness his End of the Trail, which won his fame at the San Francisco Exposition, Sherry E. Fry sometimes has a touch of anarchism in his work, which is not unpleasant. His bust memorial at St. George, Staten Island, is one of the most notable figures in this country. Paul Manship is also following a stylistic trend influenced no doubt by his Roman training. The Orient, Etruscan sculpture, and the early Florentine Renaissance all seem to have left their mark on his work, resulting, however, in one of the most splendidly original inspirations of our day. His Girl with the Dancing Fawns and his baby portrait of Pauline in the Metropolitan are works of which we may well be proud. Leo Friedlander is another artist, I don't know what that word is, archaist who is producing excellent sculpture molded on old inspiration. Gutzon Burgum has done several notable figures of Lincoln, notably the gigantic head in the rotunda of the Washington Capitol, and the full-length seated statue in Newark. His is the design for the great Confederate memorial, stretching half a mile along the side of Stone Mountain in Georgia. Among the most talented of his pupils is that young sculptor of animals and symbolic figures, Karl Ivava. And that is the end of the book. For number 466, A History of Sculpture, written by Murray Sheehan, copyright 1924. Thank God this one's done. All right, everybody, we'll see you in the next book.